Copyright in these lectures is either owned by the ANU or a third party who has licensed the ANU to use it. Students may use the recording for personal study only. No lecture may be communicated online, copied or shared without the prior permission of the ANU.
And actually, so since you've been through the whole class and I'm just coming for the day, don't hesitate to jump in with your questions. It is a view of global landscape regeneration that I want to talk to you about today. So food production and agriculture is using about half of the planet, and I'll show you that in a second, to feed ourselves. And we're drilling down into natural resources, mining soil fertility to turn it into money and food for humanity. It's not sustainable. And we've gone too far, so even if we were to sort of stop and sustain, I think a lot of people are pushing towards sustainable agriculture. But when you're in a hole, we can't, a lot of farms in Australia are on the brink. So there's not really much left to sustain. It's really more about regeneration. And then we also know a lot about the natural ecosystems out there, and we've used most of the arable farmland in the temperate developed countries, and the expansion of agriculture into natural systems is accelerating in the tropics. We're losing some of the most, the richest carbon-rich ecosystems to grazing, which is quite thin. And then to cropping, and that's also using resources. A lot of the average agricultural footprint is negative. Agriculture is both a cause and a casualty of climate change. We actually give off a lot of CO2 in our agricultural processes, but it is possible, and that's what we'll talk about today, to flip agriculture to be switch from part of the problem to part of the solution. So just being sort of less bad, being sustainable is not enough. We need to draw down carbon dioxide into vegetation and soils on agricultural lands to feed ourselves, and then also to provide habitat and climate services to the larger region in the world. So that is possible. I think that there's only one direction to go. We can't go much deeper. We've already hit rock bottom in many parts of the country. Literally, there's no soil left. We're down into the V horizon, into the kind of clay pans, and until we regenerate these agro-ecosystems, there's really no ability to feed ourselves or provide habitat or climate regulated services. So this is the story about the switch in the direction up. Now, anybody live on a farm? Yeah? Yeah. Do you work on the farm? Does it, you're also studying? That's wonderful. I grew up on a farm, and so it's in my blood, but I've been, stuck in that ivy tower now, trying to think about how our work applies on land. Most of us, 7.7 billion. There's only about 570 million farmers in the world. So even on a global average, it's more than 10 to 1 consumers to producers. And if you look at this country, there's probably only 100,000 farmers, and there's 25 million people, so you're like 250 to 1, right? It's quite a ratio of producers to consumers. And so most of the time, it's a room full of eaters and only one, or if that's a big room, producers. And if you think about our diet choice, and I heard from Brahman that you guys have done some work on the food footprint and consumption, and we think a lot about what we eat. I hope we do. We think about healthy food. We might think about trying to eat less meat because that's better for ourselves and for the environment. And well, what kind of meat and where does it come from? And maybe less packaged food, more raw foods, more farmers markets foods where you can get a direct link to the farmer that actually, or at least the indirect, someone in the family or someone in the town that knows how that food was grown. Because most of the environmental costs or the burn, if you will, in in the food system is not the transport, it's not the packaging, it's the farmer itself, it's the production. So we need to look at how much land, how much water, and how much fossil fuels, or how much regenerative potential do these farms have where our food comes from. And if you look around, we can say there's a lot of differences in climate variability, there's a lot of differences in soil variability, but probably the largest variable in the food system is the farmer themselves and how they manage their land. And so how can we know that in this global commodity system where everything's all aggregated and you don't really know where your food comes from? So that's, it's important. I think a lot of the solutions that we'll talk about really require the consumers and the producers to become connected, cut out a lot of that middle taxation, that overhead, and value good quality food for your health and for the environment. So what can producers do? This is what, if you have land, or if you know someone has land, or if you want to get into a farm share so that you can have an influence on the land, what could you do? What could you value? What questions could you ask if you knew where your food or fiber comes from? How could you reward people that are doing better on the land financially, and with just attention and popularity and likes on Facebook and all the kind of things that are important for acknowledging and incentivizing better behavior. So what we've got here is a very typical farm out on the western slopes. This is from my postdoc who's out looking for eucalypts to think about agroforestry and bring in seeds. And you can get lots of seeds off of one tree. Really, it's an opportunity to bring back the functions into the ecosystems and restore some of these gullies that are draining out not only the soil and the fertility, but the water. That all of this landscape, when it does rain, and if you get a good rain, it'll percolate through and it'll just pop right out of those creeks and wash away. And even after it's washed away, there's still any residual moisture is going to drain and evaporate straight out of those gullies. So much of this country has never been really improved in a hydrological way or in a nutrient way. It's just been open for grazing. And what's happened after clearing trees is the intense rains. A lot of these might have come out of a few years, even hundreds of years ago, storm events that washed the soil bare right after it was cleared and grazed. And so we have a legacy of unimproved land that can be fixed. And so essentially what I'll talk to you about today is agricultural regeneration, which we think is a level above restoration. It's including hydrological rehydration and remineralization, improving the water and the nutrient cycles so that we can regenerate the landscapes. It's pretty straightforward concepts. So the background, look, we talk about food security, it's agriculture. We obviously have to eat. We need to think about the regional and the global environment as well. The demand is increasing. It's not just population, but per capita consumption. We're moving up the food chain, which is more demands on land. We're also diverting a lot of food into feed and also to fuel, especially corn ethanol in the U.S. is like nearly half feeding cars and cows. We also have less land because of soil degradation and water degradation and groundwater and climate breakdown. Our ability to feed ourselves is getting more difficult quite quickly because of both the supply and the demand side. And that's putting extra stress on the rest of the land because agriculture is expanding into this regions. You get habitat loss, fragmentation, and then invasive species come in and out and cause a lot of damage, and climate change is also threatening biodiversity. So the whole agro-ecosystems together are under threat. And now we bring this new demand, which, if you guys know what was signed late 2015 in Paris, was to try to hold the global temperatures to 2 degrees or even pursue efforts to 1.5. And there's absolutely no way, even with unplugging coal and oil and gas to stabilize at 1.5 without also actively drawing down CO2 out of the atmosphere. Carbon drawdown, more realistic. We're not going to just unplug, but even at these unprecedented increases in renewable energy, we're barely keeping up with the increase in demand. And so it's very certain that we're going to need really large global approach to draw down carbon, actively draw down carbon. Now the land system, which I'll tell you about, already draws down a huge amount of carbon, but it releases it at the end of the year. And so enhancing the Earth system, which agriculture, we just said, is half of the Earth system, the land system. So the land system, as you'll see, has a cycle that's 10 times larger than humanity's annual contributions. So it takes 10 years for us to overwhelm Mother Nature. On the other hand, if we enhance the natural cycles, we can start to clean up our emissions. And that's actually in the Paris Agreement, that we're going to do things like bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. Has anybody heard of BECCS? All right, I'll give you an explanation. It's been described as this in silico solution that came up from the global integrated assessment models, which try to minimize the economic burden and still get us a stable climate. So these global economic land energy models, they have the economy as a fixed. We have to grow the economy, and we have to have livelihoods. And how can we work within those hard economic boundaries to actually deliver a livable planet? And so the flexibility is not in our economy, it's in the environmental side. And what they found was there's still rather theoretical. It's technically proven, but to go to scale with carbon capture and storage, you might have heard of clean coal. It's never really been proven, but clean coal would not actually get us anywhere. It would only be less bad than digging up coal in the first place. But bioenergy with capture can actually take that photosynthesis, and then you reburn it to get a little electricity, and then you turn the smokestacks upside down and fill up old oil wells with CO2. That's been demonstrated, and it's getting popular in the U.S. as a way of cleaning out the extra oil. They shove CO2 down in these things. So in the Paris agreements, there's a massive reliance on bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, which is very dubious because we don't really have any of these anti-coal plants that suck CO2. We also don't have enough bioenergy to feed the things. Nevertheless, somehow we need to draw down huge amounts of carbon into the land and into the soils to offset the climate. So really we've got issues with food, issues with biodiversity, and issues with the need to solve the climate crisis by drawing down CO2. So that's known as a triple threat. Here's what's really happening is that climate change is overwhelming. This is the unprecedented droughts, all right? And if you look at the more modern ones, we're still passing the Millennium Drought and passing the Federation Drought of 1902. So there's big parts of this country that just haven't seen rain, substantial rain, in years. And when it does come, it might come in a huge flood, and are we ready for that? So we've also seen unprecedented land clearing, and this is the negative emissions that I was talking about, the drawing down of CO2, these anti-coal plants. So this is in the agreements to get to 2 degrees. We need to start really in 2030 with these machines sucking down. Now, this section, these other greenhouse gases, number 1 is methane, number 2, nitrous oxide, N2O, which comes off of fertilizer, those are part of the problem. That's agriculture part of the problem. So we need to switch from being part of the problem to part of the solution, as well as completely shifting our energy system, just to have a 66% chance of holding to 2 degrees. So this is like $1 trillion a year for the economy, which it's 1 to 2% of global GDP. That sounds like a lot of money, but we're going to have a big population. You know, it's like hundreds of dollars each per year. It's actually seems outrageous, but it's very doable. Wait till you get to the rest of the talk. You'll see. So the intensifying droughts, fires and floods. This cycle, where Australia has a lot of experience, is intensifying around the world. This is our current approach, is to try to get more agriculture land. Now, running a few cows, displacing a few sheep out in these remote regions is not really delivering much food security. If you think about the trade-off in these ecosystems for a few burgers, it's really not contributing much to food security, but it is economics, because the demand is there, and when the price is high, then people want to clear land and run as many cows as possible. So these economic distortions can lead to huge influences on land. So how much land is there in the world? So a good number to remember is 10 billion, because you can count. I teach my kids, count to 10 with zeros by logs. And get to 10 billion, we'll have 10 billion people on 10 billion habitable hectares, all right? Now, half of that, essentially, hopefully not more than half, is zoned as agriculture. That's mostly grazing land, and 1.5 billion hectares of annually cropped land. And most of that crop production, plant-based food, that's where almost all of our calories, and including most of our protein, comes from. And some of this crops go to feed animals in feedlots, which could be land sparing, but has a lot of environmental footprints, especially if your crops, like corn, using a lot of fertilizer and a lot of diesel in the tractors, that has a huge fossil footprint in this food, as well as a big land footprint, right? So feeding that to animals is not so great either, and running animals around the whole country is not so great either. This just shows you how big billions of hectares are, all right? So how much is grazing land? It's about a fifth. This is the whole of North and South America. How much is cropland? It's like planting the whole. There's still some forests. The forests are cleaning up quite a bit of our pollution, and we rely on them for every breath we take without really valuing it. Okay, so here's an example of the natural cycles. Humanity really is dwarfed in comparison to natural cycles. This is the gross primary productivity, all right? Not net primary productivity. A cycle is a huge heartbeat of the planet. And this is why CO2 goes up and down every year by about 7 parts per million. Because the northern land just shuts off all winter long, releases carbon in the fall when the leaves drop, and then wakes back up in the spring and sucks it all down. And you can see the Amazon is just really the heartbeat of the planet, and the Congo rainforests. And so these tropical zones really blow up. And look at a little Australia in here. I think I might have two. No. If you look at Australia in here, it's got a little heartburn in the desert, but it's not dead. The outback is not like the Sahara Desert, which is just completely off. And it's not like Canada and Russia, which shut off for half of the year. It's there, trucking along, just low productivity, but possible. And then we have these beautiful seasonal cycles where we have, tropical wet summers in the north and temperate Mediterranean climates, wet winters in the south. All right, and New Zealand and Tasmania are going to be the destination for the climate refugees in our part of the world, right? You can see how everything's moving poleward as the climate. And the storms through the center are going to increase, so we're going to have to deal with these. So what it looks like is, in pure carbon numbers, 120 gigatons of carbon go through this cycle. See the great big cycle? And this is up to 10 now in human fossil fuel prediction. But we're talking about, more than an order of magnitude larger in the natural cycles. There's also big cycles into the ocean, where the oceans are actually pulling down a lot of our CO2 as well, but that's leading to ocean acidification. And if we do get our land use and our energy system transformed, then the CO2 in the ocean will come back up. So there's actually a hidden danger down in the ocean as well. So here it is again in units. I like to think about this as a tree breathing in a huge amount. And the leaves, of course, trees need to live at night, and they need to be able to get through the dry season. So they use a lot of their own energy for living, and they also suck that carbon down, put it into the soil, and feed a whole food web below ground, and most of that carbon comes back out again. All right, so the idea is to enhance this natural cycle by providing water and nutrients. Okay, this is the fundamental principles from the Green Revolution. But if we can increase global photosynthesis by 1% or 2%, and then reduce the losses by storing some of this biomass carbon as charcoal, or some of the root exudates as weathered rocks. All right, so trees can eat rocks with acids that they pull out of the atmosphere, and then we want to really store the carbon on this side and enhance the drawdown on that side, along with an energy change system that gets us to net negative emissions. All right, so that's kind of the way the planet needs to move in the next decade or so to have a chance. Now, we started our Center of Excellence in Plant Energy Biology in 2014 with this theme of the plant energy system is really the largest network of biochemical events on the planet. This photosynthesis, underappreciated, really drives our whole human economy as well as the natural economy. That is primary production, and we feed fuel, feed fabrication, but fuel burning is actually the problem. So it doesn't matter whether you're releasing fossil fuels or biofuels, it's CO2 in the atmosphere that's the problem. We need more drawdown and less emissions. So fuel is part of the problem. It's not part of the solution. And animals are a very inefficient way of making food. So we need less fuel. Things that we can't eat, like fodder, animals can have a role in managing landscapes, and they can, feed themselves doing it. That's important. Fabrication, more building with plant-based materials, substitutions for steel. There's lots of opportunities, even bio bricks. Options there. So this is the big one that was missing from our original proposal, but I'm putting it on the table now. Soil fertility is the ultimate sink for carbon from the atmosphere. That's got to be done with plants. And that's called drawdown. So what's happening is we're releasing a lot of fires. The drier it gets, then it burns. Our ecosystem stores are also, the best, most stable form of carbon is coal and oil and gas underground. And the biological carbon, which if we put it all on the table, including the biomass and vegetation in forests and the soil carbon, which is huge in the polar regions, especially the boreal regions, that's more carbon in soils and vegetation than in all the fossil fuels, almost by a factor of 2. So we need to put that on the books and then manage it together. And this is what, I was going to play a little video. Who's seen Greta Thunberg and George Monbiot's plea? We need more trees, yeah. This is a magic solution of a machine that can draw. Isn't it a great video? Like, so I think Extinction Rebellion, some of these environmental groups are really teaming up with so the climate groups are teaming up with environmental groups to push natural climate solutions. And their theme is protect, restore, fund, right? Like, let's take care of the forests. In the Amazon, we have a good high-resolution look at all the little fires that are happening now, and they're breaking the records. We're losing not only the actively digging fossil fuels and putting in the atmosphere, but the natural cycles are starting to lose our landscapes and our biological carbon. So protect, restore, and it's actually quite cheap. It's even lower to money. The opportunity cost of what could I get if I ran a bunch of cows on here, that's the real cost. It doesn't cost a lot to not do something or to improve it a little bit. These regeneration options are what I'm going to promote for agriculture, because there's not much left to protect, and there isn't really anything left to restore. Some of the grazing on native pastures actually should go back to restoration, and a big part of this country there's just a few animals wandering around, and so restoration is really a good option. But for the intensive agriculture zones, so this is the idea of precision landscape regeneration. We want to have high-resolution computer models, which I'll show you soon, that expand out to at least 100 million hectares of the 7.7 million square kilometers, or 770 million. Now, if it was all of Australia, it would go off on the board here, but this is about the best 100 million for agriculture, which I'll show you. And we want to put all these extra layers of potential in there to draw down more carbon. All right, so the idea is to farm within natural cycles. I'm sure you've heard about it in most of this class already. It's not particularly new or even really high tech. It's just finally getting in line with the solar cycle. So we know about diurnal and seasonal shifts. We know that there's more sun in the north, more evaporative demand. So the idea that's used in really horticulture or the wine industry is a terroir. Has everybody heard of that word before? A terroir? Just a couple of you? Like, it was a new word to me a few years ago, and it's not only the aspect in the soil conditions, but it's all these factors together that can really define a little piece of land and give that wine a flavor. So we can use that same principle to plan out farm paddocks. And they can be small little units that are important for rotations. Instead of just letting animals go everywhere and eat down their favorite crops, you let the grass grow until it's the right height, and then you can go in and mow it. So we need to have this plan. Sometimes it's called intensive rotational grazing or holistic grazing. And the same goes for crops, that we shouldn't be doing wheat. We should be doing wheat, canola, pasture. That's common. We can do corn, soybeans. That's common. And there's other type of rotations. In the West, they do lentils and wheat. So better rotations of grazing, and pastures can also be part of a system. So you might have 3 to 4 years or even 5 of pastures, and then you go back to crops. So we need a design, and I'll show you about precision landscape regeneration tools, where we work with mapping companies that make software to help farmers divide up their farm into small management units that fit into the landscape, take account of the hydrology, the solar temperature. We can see that the west corners are going to be a little drier, and the south corners could be a little wetter, and so you have the animals move through and the crops planted to match the seasonal cycles. We want to store water. So the big one for Australia especially, because our land is really only half as much water as the average in the world. So we need to think about maximizing water use efficiency in all possible ways. And one of the most important ways is catchment, rainwater harvesting. It's also called rehydration. And so you put these terraces or contours out to spread water out of creeks and hold it from flash flooding down, especially with climate change, because when we do get rain, we're becoming more intense with bigger gaps between. So we need to hold the soil as much as possible. And I was talking about this last week, and Jamie Pidakobi at the afternoon water session was saying, you're going to put all these steps into the land, and imagine this scaling up to 1/7 of Australia, then the rivers are going to run dry because you'll be holding all this water in the land. So there's a lot of uncertainty about what would happen if we were to get serious about letting the water infiltrate. And so certainly the plants would appreciate it, and they would grow, and they'll be moving the water up into the atmosphere, which can then fall back down again as rain. It's not that plants consume water, they just pump it. So there's a small water cycle, the green water cycle, that is the evapotranspiration on land, and when there's vegetation and plants, it slows that down. So when it does rain, a week later, those clouds can form again from that rain, and they can move back down. So what we don't get very often is average rainfall. And if we had just, like, if it rained once a week like some parts of the world, it's hard to imagine, but where I was before in Chicago, the rain comes so regular like a sprinkler in the afternoon, and that's how we get these huge corn crops. It's just unfathomable in Australia. But if that ever happened, we probably wouldn't have much water running down in the creeks either. The reason we have all this flash flooding is because of the extreme events. So it's not really that the land is using or the plants are using water, they're just cycling it. And they're cycling it slower than it would happen without them. So that's the principle of rehydration. That's looking at high-resolution digital elevation models, figuring out where the erosion gullies are, closing them up, spreading that water apart, planting trees along those rows to hold water and grab it from lower in the soil horizon. We also can have a chain of ponds. So instead of big evaporation ponds like Lake Burley-Griffin or these dams that they put out, we have these little small deep channels that have a little bit of surface area, and they can hold water. And you can use solar pump hydro, like I one time talked about Snowy Hydro 3.0. Instead of this massive big project down in the Snowies connecting two huge reservoirs, you could have 1 million small ones all around the country that were just storing water in ponds with a little bit of pump hydro. In fact, that's pretty common. People have a water license and they can throw a pump down in the river and they can draw out and hold it up on their farm ponds. You would like those to be covered, and you'd like to use solar energy to do that. You can also filter the water, and then you can put it out exactly where you want with some drip lines according to when the plants need it. So we're taking this heterogeneous water system, which is coming with floods and droughts, holding that in a passive way, and then finishing it off with a little active precision irrigation. Now, remineralization is another whole industry, and I was talking about, the global demand, something for miners to do. All right, so this isn't a resources class, an agriculture class, but agriculture needs remineralization in soils. Our soils are so worn thin, they don't have any biological capacity. They basically crush the dirt. So to bring dirt back to soil, we need this remineralization function. And you could think about it as compost. We can think about, there's industrial compost facilities. There's also the mineral cycle. So basalt rocks, which are young lava rocks, some of our best soils around Victoria, Gippsland, they're all in the only volcanic plains we have in Australia. And that rock is a slow time-release fertilizer. It also neutralizes acidic soils. And acidic soils are not, they don't have phosphate that's available. There might be phosphorus in that soil, but it's locked into these clays. And so raising the pH can be a big part of remineralizing it. Biochar in here is another one. I talked about how to make the biomass that we have captured permanent. We don't want to burn it. If you burn it in really low oxygen, you can fossilize it. You can actually make coal, and this is really good for soils when incorporated in the right way. So we're imagining essentially a distributed remineralization on-farm system where you're mining a little rock and crushing it, you're harvesting your own biomass and charring it on site, you're putting it down in rows with your green manures and a little bit of clay, because the composts, the microbes in the compost will take that plant material and actually put it onto clay aggregates. They're trying to get water out of the clay, and in doing so they leave themselves inside these clay components. So that microbial section is a big part of the remineralization. We're enhancing the nitrogen and the phosphate cycles, as well as the calcium and magnesium cycles in the crushed rock. So that's the water, the soil, and then we get the plants. So the last layer, of course, is the green vegetation on the top, and that's trying to get grass cover almost all year long on almost all of your farm, and having a little bit of tree cover, depending on how much rain you get, but at least 10% to maybe 30% canopy cover. And sometimes forests that are, or grasslands that are unmanaged, can be overstocked, and so they're actually light limited. They're sort of grown to their capacity, and thinning it out a little bit is why the right amount of grazing at the right time can actually lead to more grass growth, and the right amount of thinning at the right time can lead to more tree growth. So we really want to keep these systems in their mature, like adolescent phase, if you will, for, it's just blossoming. This is getting the water and the nutrients so that your ecosystem can blossom. All right, this is again in a cycle. We're talking a lot about the rainwater catchment, dams irrigation, using, of course, light for photosynthesis and warmth for photosynthesis. Not too much. You can also do that active pump hydro thing. And so these light and water cycles drive the carbon cycle. We want to grow, and then at the end of the season, capture that biomass. Don't just graze it off or feed it off or extract it or sell it. We want to drive it back down into the soil so that we can hold water and nutrients, make the nutrients available again. So there could be two cycles, the blue water cycle and the smaller green water cycle. And then you could have a ground cover cycle and a canopy cover cycle on the carbon side, building that soil below ground. Okay, so essentially this is the principles, the precision principles for landscape regeneration is to look and model and map the number of hours every day of the year that you're going to have sun, and then the temperature and the evaporative demand that's predicted from that. Water cycles, water runs downhill. Okay, so there's a few fundamental principles that you should just know and deal with in the mineral cycle. Where are your nutrients? How much nutrients do you need? Are they available? All right, so that's part of the system. The microbial piece, I would say, is a really exciting research opportunity now. We can use DNA sequencing technology. One of my main jobs is a researcher in plant genomics, where we can domesticate new crops, make climate-ready crops, build deeper root systems that have never been selected for. We can do that very quickly now with whole genome approaches that look at many genes of small effect and make accurate predictions as to what the seed will look like as an adult plant. And so we can get that same technology going for microbes, which we really can never even culture them. We don't need to anymore. You can actually directly sequence your compost material and move that living propagule into a new place in a new time and actually select for better microbes. I got a call right after this with a new company that thinks they've got the super microbe to solve climate change. It's part of the system. It's part of the system. It's part of building living skin, soils above where we're really at. All that is gone, and we're dealing with subsoils. So these are a non-renewable resource. This takes millennia to develop into soils, but we're trying to enhance that system. And I think it can be done. So one of the tricks is to get this industrial system that we have, but use it wisely, use it strategically in the right places in the right time. And this is what it looks like to grind the basalt mountains. So you can imagine the Adani coal miners. I didn't put those slides in, but they want to, move mountains to sell overseas. If instead we would go a little bit farther north into the basalt plains, north of the Galilee Basin, and extract this mineral rock dust, grind it and spread it on farms, then when it hits a raindrop with CO2 in it, then it dissolves out the calcium, and the calcium becomes carbonate. All right, so this is the idea of biogeochemical cycling. It's the same principle that when the Himalayas rose up and started to wear away 50 million years ago, the global planet started a cooling phase. So this geological cycle is very slow, but we can enhance it by crushing and grinding and spreading rocks. So it provides benefits to the climate as well as the land. These macronutrients of calcium and magnesium are really important for pH buffering. And sometimes there's 1% phosphate as well. So if you're going to grind up 10 cubes of rock and spread it out, that's a bulk, slow-release fertilizer. But it's really helpful, especially in some of our acidic soils. So that's the remineralization. The rehydration, here's another view of the terraced farming, intercropping rows of trees with pastures or crops. So you kind of think about the trees as defining The paddocks, the buffers, a lot of times they're long and thin and they stretch between two contours on the ridges and the creeks, and that's the solar pump hydro idea. These, we can design and build these in silico, but after we do, then we can learn how to manage and monitor and come up with new experiments. So it's really at the computer design stage right now, and we think that we need to develop more of these demonstration sites to really prove the principles. Here's a cartoon model of how one might look if you've got a little bit of elevation. Then you can have a storage pond and a tank on the hill, a ridge road in gray and a creek in blue, sort of the minimum basic pieces. The middle yellow parts are the crop pasture land with a forestry tree belt down the middle, and then the creek zone and the ridge line are restored to kind of nature. So you have your agriculture nested within an ecosystem. This is the agroecosystem. You're catching the water on the top and you're holding it down in the floodplain, and then you can move that around. So this is a little model. These models then stretch and lay out on every kind of square kilometer, a million of them in the country. This is how they would all stack together. So you can imagine that. Here's one real example that's actually owned by the ANU. This is right at the base of Mount Stromlo, up at the top. This is the Molonglo River down here at the bottom. Denham Prospect, I was with the kids on the weekend. Denham Prospect is right here, coming, new suburbs. And we're having trouble getting this planned as a precision regeneration station because ACT government wants to put suburbs out there, which may sound like a travesty, but even this farm operating in top shape could maybe make $300,000 a year if all the layers of the soil and the land and the trees were operating, whereas the suburbs are $300 million. It's just the best thing we could do would probably be to have a little museum along the side here where people that lived in the future suburb could see how these landscapes function. Nevertheless, it's a good testing ground to figure out how to integrate the above ground piece with the below ground piece. The design build phase has earthworks, waterworks, renewable energy, and a data system, which I'll show you in a second. Going too quick? Too many questions? All right. Let's go to the next one. This is what you can get with a click of a button from high-resolution digital elevation models. So we can see these ridges in here. We can see how the creeks would naturally flow. So there's ideas to put little ponds and catchment and some contours to spread that water around the landscape so that it doesn't just splash off. Here's the management layers. So we talked about putting the ground cover and canopy cover. Then you want this carbon capture and carbon storage above ground and below ground. That's biochar and rock dust back to feed the minerals. The microbes are squeezing the minerals out of the rocks, leaving carbon on the rocks, growing the plants. So that's another virtuous cycle. And this is what we've done in the Arboretum so far. We've developed the test equipment so that we can see. Here's the plots. There's 10 research forests over the ANU forest side. We put up this camera tower. We call it a GigaVision camera tower because it takes 100 10 megapixel images and stitches them up into a gig. Then we can zoom right down almost to leaf level pixels, or fly drones over the top so that we can get very accurate outputs of plant size, shape, and color over time. Then we can train our models to know how much water and sunlight and nutrients went into growing those plants. So then we can parameterize these models, and ultimately they can be gamified. So you can go around and put trees in different places, let them grow, watch how they grow, and design these farms so you can buy them off the plan, just like you buy a condo off the plan in the city. I think we're closer to this. Certainly the computational piece can be done. We need a lot of real work. So to get to really big scale on remote regions, there's several companies now that do this drone seeding. So if you're going to go out back in back of Burke and do this on the 100,000 hectare scale, some of these huge farms out there, you need to precision plant. And you can do that with drones and do it at this kind of whole ecosystem level. So we were trying to work with this company. How did you guys do that? And they said, well, it's just, there's a lot of people out there that have these similar ideas, but not many of us are very far in actually doing it. There's a few people in France that are doing this. It's called agroforestry. That's wheat underneath poplar trees. Now, if it was Australia, we might have a few eucalyptus trees. The rows might be 100 meters apart rather than 10 meters apart. But it's, there's lots of configurations. You could also, what's called silvopasture, you could run cows up and down these rectangular shaped paddocks. What about crops that have incredibly deep roots? So this is a colleague of mine, Jerry Glover. He's now actually managing billions of dollars in farm aid in Washington, D.C. So he left the farm where they developed these perennial crops. So this is an independent domestication, and we helped them with the genetics so that they could do in 10 years what takes primitive farmers 10,000 years through natural selection to convert wild wheat into a high seed yielding annual wheat. They've been able to convert this wild wheat into a relatively high yielding crop in just 10 years while maintaining all this biomass below ground. So it's just selecting on a few genes that give you big grains and big kernels, but maintaining all of this below ground production. So one of the reasons all of our crops are annuals is because we could breed them every year. But if you have molecular approaches to be able to breed things like we use now in personalized medicine, obviously we are long-lived creatures as well. So there's no limits to what we can do really with genetics now. So this is how we calibrate those models. This is just to show that the ecosystems, after you do some work, you lose a little carbon when you get the tractors in there, and then you can grow back out of that. In the first maybe 10 years is the maximum growth rate, especially when you add some water and fertilizer, all right? Then they sort of level out at a standard growth rate, and things would restore naturally on their own, but they might take hundreds of years to get back to that 10-ton carrying capacity, whereas the agricultural regeneration approach can keep going because they're not limited by light nutrients or water. So we know there's quite a few regenerative farmers. It could be maybe 100 lead years around the country. 50 of them are now written up as textbook examples by Soils for Life. If you look at their case studies website, there's people doing this. You go to their farm, he says, like, it's not just an idea, it's actually, and they all hit rock bottom a decade ago and had to change. So the early adopters are coming, and we're trying to make this scalable so that investors, especially Australian Superannuation Fund, we have almost $3 trillion of our own retirements just invested overseas, while the Canadian Teachers Pension Fund is buying land in Australia, right? We don't invest in our own landscapes because we're not sure that this will work. So we need these highly resolved plans to be able to demonstrate it. And it's a bottom-up solution. Government can assist, but it's really farmers to drive this. We're thinking about the Monero as a 1 million hectare region. This is Kuma's in the center, and it's a source of opportunity. There's a lot of degraded land. This is the potential tree cover from a new science paper, which also has good maps around the world. And here's the species that could be planted. We're thinking about 100 million hectares in Australia. That's 30 million pasture, 30 million cropping, and another 40 million of the better rangelands. And at 10 tons per hectare per year, across 100 million hectares, that can be 1 gigaton, or 1/10 of the world demand for carbon drawdown. We have a lot of land in this country, but it's not being used very efficiently. We see 3 scales: the farm scale, which I talked about, this regional deployment center scale, where you get thousands of farmers on thousands of hectares each to get to that 1 million hectares, and then we need 100 of those agroecosystems to scale to the nation. So it's reasonably doable, and this is the economic models where every dot could be a farm, and we could imagine a million dots all modeled out, where business as usual is sort of just losing as we go forward in the next 30 years with increased climate variability and change. So even if some farmers are doing it now, they're maybe just in a good place. Carbon farming is where you might be borrowing money to improve your land, and industrial agriculture is making money but using up your resources. So all of the things kind of fall away. Whereas